If you've ever been betrayed by someone who tried to destroy your reputation while pretending to be your ally, hit that subscribe button. Subscribe if you believe that people who weaponize psychology against psychologists eventually discover their own mind becomes the trap, because what I'm about to tell you proves that sometimes the best revenge isn't confrontation. It's creating conditions where guilt becomes so unbearable that the person who tried to ruin you destroys themselves through involuntary confession. My name is Alicia Kincaid. I'm 36 years old, and I'm a forensic psychologist specializing in interrogation analysis and guilt response patterns. And the day I induced a guilt loop so powerful that my colleague's voice crack during a recorded conversation became evidence of his crimes was the day I understood that psychological warfare isn't about being cruel. It's about being precise. But before I tell you about that voice analysis and the breakdown that followed, let me take you back to where professional jealousy became criminal conspiracy, because every story of methodical justice starts with someone underestimating exactly who they're trying to destroy. I'd been working as a forensic psychologist for the district attorney's office for 7 years when I met Dr. Malcolm Trent. He was hired as a senior consultant to evaluate interrogation protocols and train detectives in psychological interview techniques. Malcolm was 42, impressive credentials from prestigious universities, published extensively on criminal psychology and deception detection. At our first meeting, he was charming and deferential, complimenting my work on several high-profile cases. We seemed aligned professionally, both committed to improving how law enforcement used psychological principles in investigations. Over the first 6 months working together, Malcolm and I collaborated on multiple cases. I'd conduct initial psychological assessments of suspects while Malcolm would review interrogation footage and provide strategic recommendations. Our approaches complemented each other well. I focused on individual psychological profiles while Malcolm specialized in systematic analysis of interview techniques. But I started noticing something unsettling. Malcolm would sometimes take credit for insights I'd provided in our collaborative meetings. During presentations to law enforcement agencies, he'd present my analytical frameworks as his own methodologies. When I gently point this out, he'd claim he'd simply been building on shared ideas or that he didn't recall who'd originated specific concepts. The credit theft escalated over the following year. Malcolm began publishing papers that incorporated my unpublished research without proper attribution. He'd use case examples I'd shared confidentially, presenting them as his own clinical experience. When I confronted him directly, his response was dismissive. "Ideas develop through collaboration, Alicia," he said with a patronizing smile. "You can't claim exclusive ownership of concepts we discuss together. That's not how academic discourse works." I knew this was gaslighting, an attempt to make me question my own memory and contributions. But proving intellectual theft is difficult when collaboration involves extensive verbal discussion. I didn't have documentation of every conversation where I'd originated ideas Malcolm was now claiming as his. I started being more careful, documenting my work meticulously and limiting what I shared with Malcolm. But the damage to my professional reputation had already begun. Colleagues started seeing Malcolm as the innovative thinker while I was positioned as the competent but less original practitioner. 2 years into our working relationship, something worse happened. A suspect I'd evaluated in a murder case was released due to insufficient evidence. 3 weeks after his release, he committed another murder. The media coverage was extensive and damaging. Questions were raised about whether my psychological evaluation had been adequate, whether I'd missed warning signs that should have prevented his release. The scrutiny was intense and painful. I reviewed my evaluation countless times, analyzing whether I'd made errors. My assessment had been thorough and appropriate given available information, but hindsight always makes warning signs seem more obvious than they were in real time. What I didn't know at the time was that Malcolm had been systematically undermining me. He'd spoken to reporters off the record, suggesting my evaluation had been flawed. He'd raised concerns with the district attorney about my judgment. He'd positioned himself as the more experienced psychologist who could provide better quality assessments. The district attorney's office launched an internal review of my work. For 3 months, Every case I'd ever consulted on was re-examined. Every evaluation was scrutinized. The stress was unbearable. My reputation, which I'd spent a decade building, was being destroyed. Then, 5 months after the internal review began, I discovered something that changed everything. I was reviewing old case files when I found notes from a consultation with Malcolm about the suspect who'd been offended. The notes showed I'd actually flagged several concerning factors in my evaluation, and had recommended against release without additional psychiatric assessment. But the version of my evaluation that had gone to the judge was different. Key sections had been altered, my concerns had been minimized, my recommendations had been changed. Someone had tampered with my official report after I'd submitted it. I immediately compared the file version with my personal backup copies. The differences were clear and significant. My original evaluation had been substantially more cautious. The altered version made me appear to have minimized risks that I'd actually documented. I took this discovery to my supervisor. The implications were staggering. Someone had committed fraud, potentially obstruction of justice, by altering an official forensic psychological evaluation. If the original evaluation had reached the judge, the suspect might not have been released. An investigation was launched immediately. Digital forensics examined the document metadata. The alterations had been made from Malcolm's computer login, 2 days after I'd submitted my original evaluation. The timeline showed Malcolm had accessed the file, made changes that minimized my concerns and recommendations, and resubmitted it as if it were my original work. Malcolm denied everything. He claimed his computer had been compromised, that someone must have used his credentials. But forensic IT analysis showed the changes were made during hours when Malcolm was logged into the system working on other files. The access pattern was consistent with someone who had legitimate credentials, not a hacker. Malcolm was suspended pending criminal investigation. I was vindicated, my original evaluation shown to have been appropriately cautious. But the damage to my reputation persisted. Many people didn't hear about the vindication or didn't fully understand the complexity of what had happened. I was still associated with a case that had ended badly, even though my actual work had been sound. Malcolm hired an expensive attorney who argued the evidence against him was circumstantial. Yes, the changes were made from his computer, but that didn't prove he'd made them. Yes, the alterations had damaged my reputation, but proving malicious intent was difficult. The criminal case stalled. Prosecutors were concerned about proving beyond reasonable doubt that Malcolm had deliberately altered my evaluation, rather than it being some kind of technical error or unauthorized access. Meanwhile, Malcolm continued working as a consultant, though not with the DA's office. He maintained his innocence publicly, suggesting the entire situation was a misunderstanding or perhaps even an attempt by me to deflect from my own professional shortcomings. I realized that traditional legal processes might not deliver justice. Malcolm was careful, legally sophisticated, and willing to lie persistently about what he'd done. I needed a different approach, one that used my expertise in forensic psychology rather than relying on legal prosecution. I started researching guilt response patterns and confession psychology more intensively than ever before. I studied how guilt manifests physiologically and psychologically, how it can be triggered and amplified through specific environmental and conversational conditions. I knew Malcolm had to be carrying guilt about what he'd done. He wasn't a psychopath completely lacking conscience. He was a narcissist who'd committed crimes to advance his career, but narcissists still experience guilt, they just rationalize and suppress it aggressively. My plan was to create conditions where Malcolm's guilt would become impossible to suppress, where it would manifest in ways that could be documented and used as evidence of his consciousness of guilt. The strategy one developed was called guilt loop induction, a technique where you systematically activate someone's guilt through carefully constructed conversations and environmental triggers, then observe their involuntary responses. Over the next 6 months, I executed this strategy with precision. First, I reached out to Malcolm expressing a desire to move past our conflict professionally. I suggested we meet for coffee to discuss how we might repair our working relationship. Malcolm agreed, probably curious about my motivations but confident he could continue manipulating the situation. Our first meeting was carefully orchestrated. I'd chosen a cafe with good acoustics where I could record our conversation legally. I wore a small recording device disguised as a pen. Throughout the conversation, I was warm and apparently forgiving, suggesting that maybe the document alteration had been an accident or misunderstanding that had spiraled out of control. I watched Malcolm's responses carefully. He was relieved by my apparently conciliatory approach, relaxing his guard. But when I'd mentioned the specific case where my evaluation had been altered, I noticed micro-expressions of stress. His jaw would tighten momentarily. His eye contact would flicker. His breathing would briefly accelerate. These were involuntary physiological responses to guilt stimulation. Over the following months, I arranged several similar meetings. Each time I'd gradually increase the guilt pressure. I'd mention the victim's family, how they'd suffered because the suspect had been released to kill again. I'd talk about how my career had been damaged by what happened. I'd wonder aloud whether things might have been different if my original evaluation had reached the judge. I never accused Malcolm directly. That would activate his defenses. Instead, I created an environment where his own guilt thoughts had space to amplify. Each conversation, I'd introduce new guilt triggers while maintaining an appearance of professional reconciliation. I also strategically placed articles about the case in contexts where Malcolm would encounter them. I'd leave copies of news coverage in conference rooms before meetings we both attended. I'd reference the case in professional discussions knowing Malcolm would hear through our overlapping networks. Each exposure was another activation of his guilt response. After 4 months of this systematic guilt induction, I noticed Malcolm was showing signs of psychological strain. Colleagues mentioned he seemed more irritable and distracted. His work quality was declining. He'd made several errors in recent evaluations, suggesting his cognitive function was being impaired by psychological stress. Guilt, when repeatedly activated and suppressed, creates significant cognitive load. The mental energy required to rationalize and suppress guilty feelings leaves less capacity for other mental tasks. Malcolm was experiencing this effect intensely because I was systematically preventing him from fully suppressing or rationalizing what he'd done. 6 months after beginning the guilt loop induction, I arranged what would be the final conversation. I invited Malcolm to meet at my office, ostensibly to discuss collaborating on a research paper about interrogation psychology. He agreed, probably seeing it as an opportunity to rebuild professional connection and perhaps continue taking credit for my work. The meeting was scheduled for a Friday afternoon. My office was equipped with recording equipment that captured both audio and video with high quality. I'd positioned the camera to capture facial expressions and body language clearly. As Malcolm arrived, I greeted him warmly and offered coffee, the same brand that had been in my office the day I'd submitted the original evaluation that he'd later altered. Sensory triggers can activate memory associations unconsciously. We discussed the proposed research paper for about 20 minutes. Then I shifted the conversation deliberately. Malcolm, I said carefully, I've been thinking a lot about what happened in that case. The one where my evaluation was changed. He tensed immediately but maintained his innocent facade. That was unfortunate, he said. The technical issues with the document management system caused a lot of problems. There were no technical issues, I replied quietly. The forensic IT analysis was conclusive. The changes were made deliberately from your account during times when you were actively working. Malcolm's face flushed. We've been through this. My attorney explained that access logs don't prove I personally made those changes. I leaned forward, my voice gentle but firm. Malcolm, I'm a forensic psychologist. I specialize in analyzing deception and guilt responses. For 6 months, I've been documenting your physiological and behavioral responses to discussions of this case. Every conversation we've had has been recorded with your knowledge that I record professional discussions. His face went pale as he realized what I was saying. You've been studying me, he said, his voice tight. I've been observing involuntary guilt responses, I corrected. And they've been consistent and significant. Every time the case is mentioned, you show autonomic stress responses. When I discuss the victim's family, your breathing rate increases. When I mention career damage, you display micro-expressions of distress. These aren't responses of an innocent person. These are responses of someone carrying intense guilt. Malcolm stood abruptly. This is entrapment. This is unethical. You can't use psychological manipulation to create evidence against me. I remained seated, calm. I haven't manipulated anything. I've simply had conversations with a colleague while observing responses. You're showing classic guilt patterns because you're guilty. Your own mind is creating the evidence through involuntary responses you can't control. His hands were shaking now. I could see sweat forming on his forehead. The guilt loop I'd been systematically constructing over 6 months was reaching critical intensity. "Why are you doing this?" he asked, his voice cracking slightly. That voice crack was crucial. It indicated his emotional regulation was failing under the weight of accumulated guilt. "Because you tried to destroy my career to cover up your intellectual theft and your crime," I said clearly. "Because you altered my evaluation, which may have contributed to someone dying. Because you've lied persistently while watching my reputation suffer for your actions. And because I knew that eventually, your guilt would become unbearable." Malcolm sank back into his chair, his facade crumbling. The room was silent except for his heavy breathing. Then he said something I'd been waiting months to hear. "I didn't mean for anyone to die," he whispered. "I just wanted to make your evaluation look weak so I'd look better by comparison. I didn't think he'd actually kill someone else." There it was. A confession, recorded clearly on video and audio. Malcolm had just admitted to altering my evaluation with intent to damage my professional credibility, demonstrating consciousness of guilt about the consequences. But I wasn't finished. I needed more detail. "Tell me exactly what you did," I said softly, using the gentle tone that encourages confession in interrogation settings. Malcolm's resistance had collapsed completely. The guilt loop had worked. He explained how he'd accessed my evaluation file, how he'd changed key sections to make me appear to have minimized risks, how he'd been jealous of my reputation and wanted to undermine my credibility. He described taking credit for my ideas systematically over years. He admitted he'd spoken to reporters about my supposed incompetence after the suspect re-offended. Everything poured out in a guilt-driven confession that was being recorded with broadcast-quality equipment. When he finished, Malcolm looked at me with something between relief and despair. "What happens now?" he asked. "Now I take this recording to the district attorney," I said. "You just confessed to obstruction of justice, fraud, and conspiracy. You detailed your malicious intent. In your own words. After I'd systematically activated the guilt you couldn't suppress." Malcolm's face showed his realization. "You planned this. All of it. The meetings, the conversations. You were conducting an interrogation. I was creating conditions where your guilt would overcome your self-preservation," I confirmed. "And it worked because you're actually guilty. The human mind has limited capacity to suppress genuine guilt, especially when it's systematically activated. You couldn't maintain your lies indefinitely when confronted with the psychological weight of what you'd done." Malcolm tried to retract his confession, claiming I'd coerced it through psychological manipulation. But the recording showed clearly that I'd never threatened him, never promised him anything, never used coercive tactics. I'd simply had conversations and observed his responses. His confession had been voluntary, driven by guilt he couldn't contain. The recording was submitted to prosecutors. Combined with the original forensic evidence of document alteration, Malcolm's confession created an overwhelming case. His attorney tried to suppress the confession, arguing it violated professional ethics for me to record conversations designed to elicit guilt responses. But legal precedent supported my actions. I hadn't been acting as Malcolm's psychologist. We'd been colleagues having conversations he knew were being recorded. Psychological observation of someone during recorded conversations wasn't illegal or unethical. The case went to trial 8 months later. The prosecution presented the forensic evidence of document alteration, the timeline showing Malcolm's access, and most devastatingly, the video of his guilt-driven confession where his voice cracked and broke as he admitted to everything. Defense attorneys tried to argue the confession was coerced through psychological manipulation. I testified for an entire day about guilt response psychology, about how innocent people don't show consistent stress responses to discussions of crimes they didn't commit, about how Malcolm's responses over 6 months showed consciousness of guilt that couldn't be faked or induced artificially. The jury deliberated for 4 hours before returning guilty verdicts on all counts. Malcolm was sentenced to 6 years in prison for obstruction of justice, document fraud, and conspiracy. His professional licenses were permanently revoked. His published work was reviewed and found to contain extensive plagiarism of my research and others' work. His reputation was destroyed completely. But the most satisfying element wasn't the conviction. It was knowing that Malcolm's own guilt had been the weapon I'd used to expose him. I hadn't needed to prove his crimes through traditional evidence alone. I'd created conditions where his psychological response to his own guilt became evidence of that guilt. The voice crack during his confession, that moment of involuntary emotional breakdown, had been analyzed by voice stress experts who confirmed it showed genuine distress consistent with guilt disclosure. That voice crack became symbolic of the entire case. A successful manipulative man who'd thought he could lie indefinitely discovered his own mind wouldn't let him. After Malcolm's conviction, I published a paper about guilt loop induction as an investigative technique. The paper detailed the methodology I'd used, the theoretical foundation in guilt psychology, and ethical guidelines for application. The paper was controversial. Some colleagues praised the innovative application of psychological principles to investigation. Others worried about ethical implications of deliberately inducing psychological distress to elicit confessions. I argued that guilt loop induction was simply a refinement of existing interrogation psychology. Police had always used understanding of guilt and conscience to encourage confessions. I'd simply approached it more systematically with better understanding of the psychological mechanisms involved. The technique was adopted by several law enforcement agencies as part of interrogation training. Not for all cases, but specifically for situations where suspects were believed guilty but evidence was limited. Creating conditions where guilt would manifest became a legitimate investigative tool. My professional reputation was fully restored. The case became a teaching example in forensic psychology programs about how psychological expertise could be applied to complex investigative challenges. I received speaking invitations at conferences and consulting requests from law enforcement agencies nationwide. 2 years after Malcolm's conviction, I received a letter from him. It was sent from prison, several pages describing his perspective on what had happened. Dr. Kincaid, the letter began, "I've spent 2 years thinking about how you caught me. Not just the confession but the months before that when you were systematically activating my guilt without my awareness. It was brilliant psychology and ruthless strategy. You understood that my narcissism would make me think I could maintain my lies indefinitely. You knew that repeated guilt activation would create cumulative psychological pressure I couldn't sustain. You predicted I'd eventually break under that pressure." The letter continued with Malcolm's analysis of his own psychology. He'd come to recognize his narcissistic patterns, his jealousy of my success, his willingness to harm others to advance himself. Prison had forced reflection he'd always avoided. He wasn't asking for forgiveness. He was acknowledging that I'd outplayed him using the same psychological principles we'd both studied. I destroyed the letter after reading it once. Malcolm wanted continued intellectual engagement even from prison. I wouldn't provide that. He'd tried to destroy my career and had contributed to someone's death through his actions. His psychological insight now didn't change what he'd done or justify continued contact. 3 years post-conviction, a documentary production company approached me about making a film about the case. They were fascinated by the psychological chess game, the guilt loop technique, the way I'd used forensic psychology both to understand Malcolm's crimes and to expose them. I agreed to participate as a consultant, ensuring the portrayal was accurate and educational. The documentary premiered 18 months later to strong reviews. People were captivated by the psychological strategy, by how understanding guilt responses had allowed me to create conditions where Malcolm's own mind betrayed him. The voice crack during his confession was played repeatedly, analyzed by experts who explained the involuntary physiological response it represented. 4 years after Malcolm's conviction, I was promoted to Director of Forensic Psychology Services for the District Attorney's Office. My expertise was now used to train prosecutors and investigators in psychological principles relevant to criminal cases. I also continued consulting on complex cases where psychological analysis could provide investigative direction. The experience with Malcolm had taught me that sometimes the best evidence comes not from physical forensics but from understanding how human psychology responds to guilt and conscience. One case I consulted on involved a suspect who'd maintained innocence for months despite circumstantial evidence suggesting involvement in embezzlement. I used modified guilt loop techniques, creating interview conditions where his responses would reveal consciousness of guilt if he was actually guilty. After 6 weeks of strategic interviews, the suspect confessed completely, his guilt overwhelming his self-preservation just as Malcolm's had. The technique worked because it leveraged fundamental human psychology. People with conscience experience guilt that creates psychological tension. That tension can be systematically amplified through environmental triggers and conversational contexts until it becomes unbearable. When guilt pressure exceeds someone's capacity to suppress it, confession follows naturally. 5 years after Malcolm's conviction, I published a book titled The Guilt Loop, Using Forensic Psychology to Elicit Truth. The book detailed the theoretical foundation, practical methodology, and ethical considerations for guilt-based investigative approaches. It became required reading in several forensic psychology graduate programs. The book also explored philosophical questions about the nature of guilt and conscience. Why do people feel guilty? How does guilt function psychologically? When is using guilt as an investigative tool ethical versus manipulative? These questions had become central to my professional identity. I also discussed my personal experience with Malcolm, carefully framing it as a case study while acknowledging the emotional complexity of being targeted by someone I'd considered a colleague. The betrayal had been profound. His systematic attempts to undermine my career had been cruel. But my response, methodical and grounded in psychological expertise, had transformed personal victimization into professional vindication. 6 years after the conviction, Malcolm was released from prison after serving his sentence with good behavior credit. He'd completed extensive therapy focused on narcissistic personality patterns and professional ethics. His release generated media attention, with reporters asking if I was concerned about him seeking revenge. I wasn't worried. Malcolm wasn't violent. He was a narcissist who'd committed fraud and obstruction of justice for career advancement, not someone who posed physical danger. Moreover, his professional reputation was destroyed. He couldn't practice psychology, couldn't publish credible research, couldn't regain the status he'd once had. He'd lost everything he'd valued most through his own actions. I heard through professional networks that Malcolm had moved to another state and taken a job in an unrelated field. He was reportedly living quietly, attending therapy regularly, trying to build an ordinary life after the spectacular collapse of his professional one. His story became a cautionary tale about narcissistic ambition and the dangers of allowing jealousy to drive unethical behavior. 7 years post-conviction, I received an unexpected email from Malcolm. He wrote that he'd completed extensive therapy and had gained genuine insight into his narcissistic patterns and the harm he'd caused. He acknowledged that his actions had been inexcusable and that he deserved the consequences he'd faced. The email wasn't asking for forgiveness or reconciliation. It was simply acknowledging reality and expressing that he'd learned from his catastrophic mistakes. I didn't respond to the email. Some situations don't require or benefit from continued contact. Malcolm had faced consequences for his actions. He'd apparently gained some insight through forced reflection. But that didn't create any obligation on my part to engage with him further. 8 years after the case concluded, I was invited to present at an international conference on forensic psychology. My topic was the intersection of psychological expertise and personal experience in investigative work. The presentation examined whether being personally targeted had made me more or less effective in building the case against Malcolm. I argued it had made me more effective because I'd understood viscerally what was at stake. My motivation to achieve justice was heightened by personal investment. But my methodology remained professional and grounded in sound psychological principles. I'd never let emotion override expertise. The guilt loop technique worked not because I was angry but because I understood guilt psychology deeply. During the question period, someone asked if I'd ever experienced ethical concerns about deliberately inducing psychological distress in Malcolm through systematic guilt activation. I acknowledged the ethical complexity but maintained that creating conditions where someone's own conscience caused distress was fundamentally different from inflicting external harm. Malcolm's guilt was real, earned through his actions. I'd simply prevented him from continuing to suppress and rationalize it. 9 years after Malcolm's conviction, I was recognized with a Lifetime Achievement Award from the American Psychological Association for contributions to forensic psychology. The award acknowledged my research, my practical application of psychological principles to criminal investigation, and my development of guilt loop methodology as an investigative tool. During my acceptance speech, I talked about the Malcolm case without naming him specifically. I discussed how being targeted had taught me that psychological expertise could be both shield and sword, that understanding human behavior created power that could be used for justice when applied ethically. I also acknowledged the survivors and victims in cases I'd worked on over my career. The forensic psychology work I did ultimately served them, helped identify perpetrators and achieve accountability. Malcolm had tried to destroy my career because he was threatened by my competence. Instead, he'd created the circumstances for me to demonstrate exactly how effective psychological expertise could be when applied strategically and methodically. 10 years after leaving prison, Malcolm published a memoir about his experience. The book was titled The Narcissist's Fall: How Pride and Jealousy Destroyed My Career. In it, he detailed his crimes, his psychology, and the investigation that had exposed him. He devoted several chapters to analyzing my guilt loop technique, explaining from the target's perspective how effective and inescapable it had been. I appreciate now what Dr. Kincaid understood that I didn't. He wrote in the book, "She knew that guilt, genuine guilt about real harm caused, cannot be indefinitely suppressed. She created systematic conditions where my guilt had nowhere to go except outward through confession. She won not by being cruel but by being psychologically precise." The memoir received mixed reviews. Some readers found his insight valuable. Others felt he was still seeking attention and trying to profit from crimes and betrayal. I didn't read the book beyond the excerpts others sent me. Malcolm's perspective on what happened wasn't something I needed or wanted. Today, at 36 years old, I continue working as Director of Forensic Psychology Services. I've trained hundreds of investigators in psychological principles, consulted on thousands of cases, and helped achieve justice in situations where traditional evidence was limited. The guilt loop technique, refined and codified through my work and others' research, has become an accepted tool in forensic psychology practice. It's used ethically, with clear guidelines about when and how to apply guilt-based investigative approaches. Malcolm's case remains the teaching example. The systematic activation of guilt leading to involuntary confession, documented through recordings that showed physiological and psychological breakdown. The voice crack that became symbolic of conscience, overwhelming self-preservation. Students study the case to understand both the technique's effectiveness and its ethical implications. When is it appropriate to deliberately induce psychological distress through guilt activation? How do you distinguish between appropriate investigative psychology and unethical manipulation? These questions have no simple answers, but Malcolm's case provides concrete context for exploring them. I also mentor other forensic psychologists who've been targeted or undermined by colleagues. Professional jealousy exists in every field. Understanding how to document unethical behavior, protect yourself legally, and ultimately achieve accountability using professional expertise is crucial knowledge I can now share. The experience with Malcolm taught me that expertise is power only when applied strategically. I'd always been competent, but being forced to defend myself against someone trying to destroy my career taught me how to weaponize that competence in ways I'd never needed to before. I learned to document meticulously, to think several moves ahead, to understand how psychological pressure could be applied systematically over time to achieve specific outcomes. These weren't just skills for dealing with Malcolm. They were skills that made me better at my work generally. Understanding how to induce guilt loops helped me become more effective at interviewing suspects and witnesses. Knowing how to systematically activate psychological responses improved my ability to evaluate whether someone was being truthful or deceptive. Malcolm had tried to destroy me but had inadvertently made me a more formidable forensic psychologist. Looking back over the decades since Malcolm first tried to undermine my work, I'm struck by how completely the tables turned. He'd been the senior psychologist with impressive credentials. I'd been the younger colleague he thought he could exploit and discredit. But he'd made a critical miscalculation. He'd assumed that because I was younger and less published, I was less capable. He'd confused the career stage with actual expertise. In reality, my specialization in interrogation psychology and guilt responses meant I understood exactly the psychological terrain where our conflict would ultimately be decided. When he'd altered my evaluation to damage my reputation, he'd created the conditions for me to study him as I would study any subject showing signs of guilt and deception. Every interaction after that became data collection. Every conversation was an opportunity to observe his responses and refine my strategy. Malcolm had thought he was engaging with a colleague. I'd been conducting an extended psychological evaluation of a guilty person trying to maintain innocence. The power dynamic he'd assumed, experienced psychologist over younger colleagues, had never been real. From the moment I'd discovered the document alteration, I'd been the one with power because I'd understood psychology more deeply in the specific domain that mattered. The guilt loop worked because I'd studied guilt responses more thoroughly than Malcolm had. The recorded confession happened because I'd created precise psychological conditions while he'd been reactive and defensive. The voice crack that became key evidence occurred because I'd understood how emotional regulation fails under sustained guilt pressure. None of this was luck or chance. It was expertise applied methodically over months to achieve a specific outcome. Malcolm's conviction and the destruction of his career weren't revenge in the emotional sense. They were consequences of his own actions revealed through psychological processes he'd studied academically, but hadn't understood deeply enough to recognize when they were being used against him. If this story showed you that people who try to destroy psychologists using psychological tactics eventually discover that expertise cuts both ways, hit that like button. Subscribe for more stories about forensic psychology, guilt-based investigation, and using professional knowledge to achieve justice against people who think they're untouchable. Drop a comment about whether you think guilt loop induction is ethical investigative technique or psychological manipulation. Because sometimes the question isn't whether a method is manipulative, but whether the manipulation serves justice by revealing truth that would otherwise remain hidden. Malcolm was guilty. My technique didn't make him guilty or create false confession. It created conditions where his actual guilt became impossible to suppress, where his own mind demanded confession as the only way to reduce unbearable psychological pressure. The voice crack during that confession, analyzed and replayed as key evidence, represented the moment when psychological pressure exceeded his capacity to maintain lies. That moment happened because I'd systematically built that pressure over months, activating his guilt through carefully constructed conversations and environmental triggers. Some people argue this approach is ethically questionable because it deliberately induces distress. I counter that the distress was already present, created by Malcolm's guilty knowledge of what he'd done. I simply prevented him from continuing to suppress and rationalize that distress. The guilt was real. The confession it ultimately produced was accurate. And justice was served through understanding rather than through traditional evidence alone. The Malcolm case fundamentally changed forensic psychology practice regarding how guilt can be used investigatively. Before, guilt was understood primarily as something that might motivate confession spontaneously. Afterwards, guilt became something that could be systematically activated and amplified to overcome resistance to confession. This represented a significant advancement in understanding how psychological knowledge could serve investigation and justice. It also created new ethical frameworks about when and how such techniques should be applied. Today, guilt loop induction is taught in forensic psychology programs with explicit ethical guidelines. It's appropriate when someone is believed guilty based on other evidence, when confession is needed to complete the case, and when the technique is applied by trained professionals who understand both the methodology and its limitations. It's inappropriate when used as a fishing expedition against people without reasonable suspicion, when applied without proper psychological training, or when the goal is coercion rather than truth discovery. Malcolm's case provides the template for both the technique's effectiveness and its ethical application. Everything I did was documented, recorded, and later reviewed by courts and professional bodies. The methodology was found appropriate, the results were accepted as evidence, and the outcome, Malcolm's conviction, was upheld through appeals. The precedent established through his case has been cited in subsequent cases where guilt-based investigative psychology was used. Each citation reinforces that understanding and activating guilt responses is legitimate forensic psychological practice when done ethically and professionally. Malcolm himself acknowledged in his memoir that my approach had been brilliant psychology rather than simply manipulation. He'd studied the same psychological principles I had. He simply hadn't understood them deeply enough to recognize when they were being applied to him or to resist their effects once he recognized what was happening. That's the fundamental lesson of the entire case. Expertise without depth is performance. Real expertise is understanding principles so thoroughly that you can apply them creatively in novel situations and recognize when they're being applied to you. Malcolm had performed expertise through his publications and credentials. I'd actually possessed expertise through a deep understanding of specific psychological domains. When our conflict moved into the domain of guilt psychology, where I had genuine deep expertise, the outcome was inevitable. His guilt, his conscience, his human psychology, all became tools I used to expose what he'd done. The voice crack that broke his confession wasn't a weakness. It was humanity. The moment when his capacity to suppress guilty knowledge failed completely under systematic psychological pressure I'd carefully constructed over months. If you've learned anything from this story, let it be this. People who underestimate you will do so based on surface characteristics rather than actual capability. When you're targeted by someone who thinks you're less competent, less dangerous, less strategic than they are, remember that their underestimation is your advantage. Malcolm saw a younger colleague he could exploit and discredit. He missed that I specialized in exactly the psychological terrain where our conflict would be decided. His oversight cost him his career, his freedom, and his reputation. My expertise, which he'd tried to steal and undermine, became the weapon that exposed and destroyed him. Sometimes revenge is dramatic confrontation. Sometimes it's patient documentation and methodical application of expertise until the person who tried to destroy you destroys themselves through their own guilty conscience, amplified by psychological techniques they didn't understand deeply enough to resist. The voice crack that became evidence wasn't something I created. It was something Malcolm's own mind produced when the psychological pressure of guilt became unbearable. I just created the conditions where that moment would happen, be recorded, and serve justice. See you in the next one.